Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I am your host, the OT Astarties, and welcome back to yet another installment of Astarties analysis. And as I say once again, it has been a long while since I've done one of these. So, now we are continuing on, or we've got to the end of Season 3 of Hetty Feather. So, we got 2 more episodes to get through, so we may as well get on with it. So, now they've left the Foundling Hospital, Hetty is about to start a new life, serving in Calendar Hall with Gideon and Sheila. So, episode 9 starts with the carriage arriving at Calendar Hall, which is a few miles away from London. Hetty, Sheila and Gideon meet Mrs. Penhaligon, Mrs. Penhaligon, who is played by Nina Wadia, of whom is the housekeeper, and from goodness gracious me! It was a TV show in the 90s, I believe. Yeah, it had a lot of actors that play more serious roles now. So it's where, what's his face from Still Open All Hours? The man from Unforgotten. Shahiv Bashkar, am I saying that right? Mira Sayal, of course. She was also, well, I knew her best as Rani Chandra's mom in the Sarah Jane Adventures. It's a very different role to what we're used to from Nina Wadia. And Hetty is not so sure about her due to her strict and uptight attitude. The former foundlings enter the house and the titles begin. So we've still got the old titles from the Foundling Hospital. We're in that transition period of getting used to the new location. So, Sheila, Hetty and Gideon look around the foyer. They introduce themselves as Sheila verbalises her entire CV, but she is told to speak when she is spoken to by Mrs. Penhaligon. Sheila verbalises an entire CV, but she is told to speak only when spoken to by Mrs. Penhaligon, who later briefs them, and their work will start after she speaks. So she basically goes, your work starts now. While being shown to their quarters, Mrs. Penhaligon continues to tell them about the rules and regulations of the house. A servant called Agnes shows Gideon to his quarters. Due to Hetty being a last-minute arrival, Sheila is made to sleep in the kitchen for the time being. When Mrs. Penhaligon is gone, Sheila angrily rants at Hetty for taking her job. She then stumbles upon the evidence that will be used against Matron Bottomly, which is the Green Book. Sheila tells Hetty that she doesn't need this, as Matron Bottomly is now in prison, and at that moment, Agnes comes in, summoning them into the drawing room. Hetty and Sheila are both welcomed by the calendars. Mrs. Penhaligon doesn't seem to like the traditions and insists that they are staff. Now we go to outside, where a gardener is instructing Gideon to keep the lawn tidy. The gardener goes off to tidy the walled garden, which Gideon is suspicious about. So Gideon follows him to see the gardener approaching a young woman. So we got Tech Kitchen. No, Cook Jenkins isn't here anymore, sadly. Or is she? I am the Force ghost of Cook Jenkins 1 Kenobi. The Force is strong in this one. Hey up. You strike me down, Jodie, and I shall be more powerful than you can ever imagine. Use the Force, Sheila. Use the Force. Hetty and... it would be more bearable than Kenobi. Hetty and Sheila are in the scullery. Sheila has a taste of some ice cream that she is making, and Mrs. Penhaligon arrives to tell them off, and she orders Hetty to go to her quarters immediately. Penhaligon then instructs Sheila to set up her bed for the night. So, in that night, while Hetty is writing her journal, Mrs. Penhaligon locks up Calendar Hall. Sheila calls out by... Sheila is spooked by this, and she calls out by asking if anybody is there. She does this while she is armed with a rolling pin. So she leaves the scullery and screams, running off to Hetty. Yeah, because a rolling pin is a very powerful weapon, folks. Aye. Sheila has been taught in the ways of the Force. So when Sheila goes to Hetty's quarters, they both acknowledge the noises out there, and Sheila asks if she can sleep in the quarters tonight, and to which Hetty accepts. We immediately cut now to a dark alley where Mr. Brunston is blaming a child for messing up. Matron Bottomly then comes up and begs Mr. Brunston for more help. He informs her that Hetty took Mr. Grace's book with her to Calendar Hall, so he offers the solution that Matron should fix things with Rosamond, but Matron is too fixated on going to America to think about it. Later that morning, Hetty and Sheila are both woken by Mrs. Penhaligon. I love the synchronicity that both actors have when they're woken up. Like, they both immediately rise, like they're like, you know when the Undertaker does that kick out thing that he does. It's kind of like that. Sheila is asked why she's not been in the scullery, and says that she heard a noise in the night and she got scared. Hetty is told to take Mrs. Calendar's breakfast up, as she has a very busy day ahead of her. She asks where her room is and is given directions by Mrs. Penhaligon, but she leaves immediately after this. So Hetty then goes into the other room, and while she is gone, Sheila looks in Hetty's suitcase and she reads a bit of the Green Book. Hetty peers her head and Sheila hides the book behind her back, and she tells her to immediately go. Sheila leaves with the book. So back in the dark alley, Matron Bottomly is describing the appearance of Hetty and Sheila to two boys who are both disguised. She sends them off to find the book and to clear their reputations. Hetty is taking Mrs. Calendar's tea up and she's having trouble finding her room. Emily, their eldest child, then introduces herself and then has a massive whinge. Mr. Calendar then shows his face, and Emily tells her father that she went to see her brother and Mr. Calendar's heir, Edwin, and reports that he is very bored. Mrs. Penhaligon then prompts Hetty to be where she needs to be, and then Constance, the youngest child, introduces herself and notices that Emily has a book behind her back. She reveals the book, which it turns out to be Grey's Anatomy, to which George very much detests. Agnes then arrives to take Constance off to the nursery maid. It's not Elizabeth, don't worry. Sadly, it's not Elizabeth. And Hetty is told to make the tea once again, as it is cold. Emily is also reminded of a dressmaker's appointment that is coming, and that a family are coming for dinner while she strops off. And Mrs. Penhaligon seems determined to integrate the Calendars back into British society. You can already see how much I'm loving the Calendars. So we've got one stroppy progressive teenager, one miserable father, Rosamond who barely sees anybody. I swear to God, this could be a sitcom. At Home with the Calendars. But yeah, that's what we should call it. So, outside in... Oh yeah, and we've also got the other staff members who are just there. So yeah, this really isn't Downton Abbey, folks. So we go back to outside. While the gardener is at work, Gideon spots a boy in the window. This is confirmed to be Edwin, who, according to Mrs. Penhaligon, is ill. So, presumably Hetty has now reboiled the tea, and Hetty is delivering it to Rosamond's room. Rosamond asks her how she's fitting in. Hetty likes it more than the Foundling Hospital, which Rosamond calls a hard regime. She comments on matrons being strict, and after Hetty says that she had very good friends there, Rosamond tells her that her stepdaughter could use a friend, and that if she sees anything that she ought to know about, she is to tell her. After this, Hetty leaves with much possible suspicion. Agnes is getting the cutlery out, and Gideon comes in and is told to take the produce up to the larder. While on his way, he passes Hetty, and she asks Gideon if he is alright. But the gardener interrupts them and reminds Gideon to take up both of those crates, and jokingly asks if he's scything off or not. Hetty then comes to her borrowed brother's defence, and the gardener introduces himself as Jack, who informs Hetty that Gideon takes orders from him now. When Jack is gone, Gideon says that he saw him with someone who he presumed was the daughter of the house. Agnes and Jack both call them to carry on with their selected tasks. And Hetty is told to get Emily's coffee. Oh, she's very progressive, all right. She likes coffee. Outside, Sheila is beating the rugs when the delivery boys in disguise come in. One of them tries to woo her and distract her with a conversation, and one of the boys goes off to the pantry while the other gives Sheila a cinnamon bun. Meanwhile, Hetty walks past Mrs. Penhaligon and Agnes both setting the table, and she is called over. Hetty is told to dust the silverware, the furniture and the picture frames, and her work will be checked for any finger marks later on. Agnes takes Hetty's tea tray and wishes her luck sarcastically, with a smile on her face. Meanwhile, Emily is attempting to leave, but she is stopped by Rosamond, who reminds her that this is not India. Emily then argues with her stepmother and asks if Edwin will be getting the same treatment. She then goes up, passing Mrs. Penhaligon. Back in the garden, Jack heads off and is stalked by Gideon again. We get a montage of Gideon walking through Calendar Hall and one of the delivery boys searching for the green book. The street kid finds only a bunch of folders and then he leaves. Meanwhile, Gideon stumbles into Edwin's room. Edwin claims that he is not ill but rarely seen at all. He talks about garden specimens, and then we cut back to the delivery boy who avoids getting seen by Agnes, and then Emily, who sneaks upstairs into Edwin's room. Edwin claims that he is not ill but rarely seen at all. He talks about garden specimens, and then we cut back to the delivery boy who avoids getting seen by Agnes, and then Emily, who sneaks upstairs. Emily then goes into the cupboard and looks to try on Hetty's uniform. Meanwhile, Edwin and Gideon are both interrupted by Mrs. Penhaligon. Gideon leaves and Edwin is asked who he's talking to. He is told that lunch is ready and that Agnes will be there to collect him. When Mrs. Penhaligon leaves, Gideon needs to find a way out. He wheels Edwin to the bookcase as per his instructions, and a secret door is revealed which will take him into the drawing room. And now we cut back to Romeo and Juliet, where... wrong thing. The disguised delivery boy and Sheila are both talking, and Sheila is asked out. But the delivery boy who went into Calendar Hall comes to inform his colleague that the order is not complete. They both head off and are yelled at by Sheila, who says that the bun is stale anyway. The dynamic duo then change the plan and state that they need Hetty Feather. And now we get back to cheery Mrs. Penhaligon, who inspects Hetty's cleaning. She says that it is passable and tells her to get some firewood from the shed. Before she goes, Mrs. Penhaligon adjusts Hetty's uniform as it looks out of place. Hetty goes down a set of stairs and into the scullery. She then goes outside and is told to get a move on by Agnes. However, the street boys are hiding in plain sight and they ambush Hetty. They take her to Mr. Bronson and Matron Bottomly, but we end the episode finding out that they got Emily instead. Oh dear. And now we go on to the final episode of Series 3, which is episode 10. So we begin with Hetty walking into Calendar Hall with a stain on her uniform while carrying a basket. Mrs. Penhaligon comes and she asks for the whereabouts of Emily as the dressmaker has just arrived, and she comments on Hetty's apron getting dirty. When Hetty goes to change her uniform, she realises that the spare uniform has just disappeared. She then goes to her quarters to look for Mr. Grace's book as she suspects that there is a thief. She finds that has also been stolen, which makes Hetty conclude that Matron Bottomly has returned to steal it. After the title sequence, we see Emily now with Matron Bottomly and Mr. Brunston. Matron tries to reassure her that they will get her out in due course as she locks her in a cell. Because nothing says you'll be going out soon like locking somebody up. Matron is then asked by Mr. Brunston if she is right about the fact that Emily's father will come for her and that they need the green book. Matron, however, is still reluctant to let Emily out. Back to Calendar Hall, where Hetty delivers Mr. Calendar's lunch. He is busy and asks Hetty if she is settling in okay. Hetty puts the tray down and looks at a newspaper, which has a story about Matron Bottomly. She is distracted at the news, but George reassures that Matron will soon be apprehended, and he gets back to work. Mrs. Penhaligon then asks Jack if he's seen Emily. Jack says no. When Gideon is asked, he says that she was seen yesterday, but not since. Mrs. Penhaligon leaves, telling them both to direct her to her way if she is seen. Meanwhile, in the laundry room, Sheila is not convinced by Hetty's claims as to the green book being stolen. This is because Sheila is in possession of the book at the moment. Hetty tells her that someone left her case on her bed and that the spare uniform has been stolen. When asked if she's seen anything suspicious, Sheila recounts the delivery boys talking to her, realising that she was then tricked. Really? So they both go upstairs and they see a load of stale bread. Hetty tells Sheila to get rid of it while she goes to ask Gideon. Now we go on to Emily's lovely stay with Matron Bottomly, where Emily's in a cell when Matron Bottomly offers her water. Emily stands up asking if she wants money and then goes on to remind her that Daddy will pay to get her out. She sounds so much like one of those rich girls saying, "Oh, Daddy can pay for it. I use Daddy's credit card all the time." Matron says that there is no need to do so as she wouldn't want to upset her parents. Matron then explains that this was a case of mistaken identity and that one of her servants has something that she needs, and when she has this object, Emily will be set free. She then intends to send a note through the side door which she believes that Emily would know about. Emily responds in a sarcastic manner which escalates Matron, forcing her to... Back to Calendar Hall now. Hetty is talking to Gideon about who else could have sent the child thieves. Gideon warns her of Mrs. Penhaligon's search for Emily, and Hetty tells him that she thought that Emily was going to meet with Jack. After Gideon reminds her that she's been working with him all morning, Hetty suspects that Emily has been caught up in something. Jack walks in and Hetty asks him if he's seen Emily, as she has gone missing, but Jack is unaware of what happened. She informs him about Emily handing him a letter. Jack replies by telling her that he doesn't know anything and that he leaves the letters under a brick behind the east gate. Hetty wants to look at that note, but Jack seems to not want to get involved. But Hetty goes off to the east gate anyway, while Gideon goes off to see Edwin. So Hetty goes off to find the note when she sees one of the street kids. The street kid offers to trade the book for Emily, and Hetty is given a note. It strictly orders her not to tell anybody about this, including the police. And Hetty says that she doesn't have the book, but the street kid doesn't believe her. He threatens to smuggle Emily away to a faraway land, but Hetty stops him and promises to give him the book by 5 o'clock. Now to Edwin's room, Gideon asks if he's seen Emily or not. Edwin says that she is always going missing and that she came by at lunch, but implies that he knows her whereabouts because he knows where she went but promised not to tell anybody. He also says that she was dressed in disguise. Outside, a carriage pulls up and Hetty sees a man step out. His name is Henry and he is a friend of the family. He's questioned on Emily, but he just goes off to leave a note to inform her that she has missed her lessons. It turns out that the notes were from him to organise her lessons. He also says that Emily wants to be a doctor, but her father doesn't approve. She informs him about Emily getting captured and to not to call the police, and Henry is asked for help. Meanwhile, Gideon is reminded by Jack to keep working as he passes him. Gideon is in need of seeing Hetty, and just at that moment, his prayers are answered as she comes in looking for her borrowed brother. Gideon tells Hetty about Emily wearing her spare uniform, presuming that everything is fine, until Hetty tells her about Matron holding her hostage. Jack interjects, prompting her to tell Mr. Calendar, but Hetty is ignorant and asks Jack if he can spare Gideon for about an hour. Jack allows this, and Hetty informs Sheila as well. Sheila is told to keep the book in case something happens, and Hetty hopes to return by 5. When Hetty and Gideon are gone, Agnes comes in to remind Sheila about the eggs that are in the outhouse. And Sheila is asked about Hetty, and she lies to Agnes, and the servant says that Mrs. Penhaligon is looking for her. Gideon is introduced to Henry, and Hetty asks to be taken to Mrs. Smith's institute. Henry then talks about a letter that Mrs. Calendar wrote and wants delivering, and they set off to get Emily back. And I've just noticed something. That Hetty and Henry are both names of Hoovers that you can buy. So back to Mrs. Penhaligon, who is still looking for Emily. She goes to see Edwin, and she is told that she came by this morning and is evasive when asked whether Emily said anything to him. Mrs. Penhaligon goes to look by herself when Edwin offers to help as he wants to go in the garden. But he is reminded to keep to his room, and Mrs. Penhaligon sternly tells him that she is in charge and leaves. Hetty and Gideon arrive at Mrs. Smith's institute and is spotted by Jess. Hetty asks her where Mr. Grace's den is. Then we go back to Calendar House, so and Mrs. Penhaligon comes in to bring in the tea tray as Hetty is unavailable at this moment. Rosamond is concerned as to where Emily is and goes off to tell George, but according to Mrs. Penhaligon, George is not to be disturbed. Mrs. Penhaligon comments and criticises her parenting by saying that Emily didn't have enough discipline in India. Sheila brings the eggs into the scullery, all uncracked and clean, of which pleases Agnes. She calls cook for some more when Mrs. Penhaligon comes in looking for Hetty. Sheila lies again and then talks about Ida and then the other events leading up to this current episode that have happened over this past few seasons. The scene continues with her gossiping with Agnes as she comes in. Meanwhile, in London, Hetty and Gideon arrive at Mr. Grace's den. They get past the kids from earlier and they split up and look for clues. Sorry, no, that's not Scooby-Doo. This isn't Scooby-Doo. And I would have gotten away with it too, if it wasn't for you meddling kids. They eventually find Emily and sneak her out until the street kids surround Hetty. She tells Gideon and Emily to go, and Matron Bottomly meets her once more. Emily and Gideon both leave in Henry's carriage. Sheila carries on talking about Matron living rent-free in Hetty's head, which Mrs. Penhaligon terminates, as she says that when Hetty returns, she will be dismissed, aka she'll be fired. Meanwhile, Matron Bottomly locks up Hetty once more, but tells her about the book being at Calendar Hall and the arrangement. Mr. Bronson refuses to help her and she leaves. The carriage returns and Emily comes back to Calendar Hall, which Rosamond turns up demanding an explanation. So George assembles the calendars and the staff. They talk about Hetty being errant, which is interrupted by Sheila giving George the green book. Gideon explains that the book will be handed over that afternoon. George asks whether Matron Bottomly can be trusted, but Rosamond knows her all too well. The servants are all dismissed and Emily is told to get changed. Rosamond tries to explain what's happening, but her husband doesn't need one. Meanwhile, Matron Bottomly doesn't believe what Hetty has just told her and thinks that she is setting her up. Hetty talks about her getting fired and not seeing Ida anymore. But still, Matron doesn't listen to her and asks why she puts such value on family. Hetty replies by saying that's where we all come from and it's all that she ever wanted. Matron then tells her that thinking like that will always hold her back. This leads to Hetty asking her if she is happy. When 5 o'clock strikes, Matron Bottomly decides to partake in the trade and goes to Calendar Hall. Matron meets Rosamond, who has the book, and the trade is done. And just like that, a police officer turns up. Rosamond did this so that she can be responsible for looking after Hetty. Matron threatens to tell George about her past, and as she is arrested, pleads to Rosamond to tell everybody how she cared for her. But Rosamond stands her ground, and Hetty says goodbye to her foe one last time. Matron is dragged away and picks up the book and she takes it in, hiding it behind her back. After the arrest, George, Rosamond and Hetty walk back into the house where Emily apologises and is dismissed. Mrs. Penhaligon bashes on about Hetty's behaviour until Rosamond chips in and says that she will handle this. We then cut to a carriage leaving where everyone thinks that Hetty's seemingly fired, but in actuality, she isn't, and she turns up on Ida's doorstep reuniting with her mother. So the calendar's dinner party then begins, and much to Mrs. Penhaligon's dismay, George says that his children feel like they need to belong. Downstairs, meanwhile, the staff are talking over food. Sheila wants to be upstairs with all the rich people when Gideon brings her down to reality by saying that downstairs is their life now. And then back to Ida's house. Hetty is talking with her mother as she has some time off. So she tells her that she wants to be a maid and that she will write to her mother when she has saved up enough of her wages. We end with Hetty talking to Ida about the events that have happened since they last saw one another. We get scenes of Mr. Bronston getting arrested, Matron Bottomly getting a mugshot, and Rosamond burning the green book. Emily then sees this happening and is immediately dismissed, and the final shot of the series is with Hetty returning to the Calendar Hall in her carriage. Well, and this is my least favourite episode so far. I mean, first of all, the characters in Calendar Hall. It's like when, in that scene in the Transformers G1 movie, when the Decepticons are reincarnated, so the Insecticons, Skywarp, Thundercracker and Megatron become Galvatron, Cyclonus and the Sweeps. But this time the characters are low quality. First of all, let's start off with the Calendar family as a whole. Right, so George is always working and he detests anything that Emily wants to do. Rosamond is portrayed to be the wicked stepmother. Emily is this arrogant and progressive liberal who detests tradition. And Edwin just is told to stop in his room. Edwin, I feel, is a bit smug at times, and Constance is rarely seen in the few episodes that we've had, so only a fair few scenes. Staff-wise, and as if Hetty thought she was free of strict staff members, well, Mrs. Penhaligon changes all that. She is very strict, to say the least. I think that she wants her staff to be the best they can be and more efficient. You know, she cares a lot about efficiency. She has no right, however, to interfere within the calendar's affairs by criticising Rosamond and George's parenting. Mrs. Penhaligon has all these standards for not just the staff but everyone else as well, that she feels everyone needs to be like. You know, Edwin as an example, he is isolated in his room and not doesn't have any contact with the outside world other than the garden. I do feel sorry for Edwin sometimes because of how he was isolated by Mrs. Penhaligon. Jack is just a guy who wants everyone to work all the time and not scythe off. Whereas Agnes is annoyingly smug. It's as if she wants Hetty to be fired. These are our first impressions of these characters. And the first impression is everything, especially when it comes to characters. So next series, we will see how these Calendar Hall characters develop. And I will see if I change my mind later on as we go into the later series. As for the series in general, I think season 3 was much weaker than series 2 and 1. I do feel as though the farewell service should have been left as the season finale because, you know, we're saying goodbye to all the characters from the Foundling Hospital. Hetty's going off to a new life and Matron Bottomly is getting arrested. The escape door was completely irrelevant and that she should have been arrested. It kind of makes the final look a bit underwhelming. And I think that, you know, the big matron's descent into insanity would have been completed if the farewell service had been the season finale. Mr. Bronston is just now Mr. Grace's lackey and just a friend of Matron Bottomley's. He's just the guy who basically gives Matron the intel. For the Foundling Hospital portion, this kind of is a goodbye to a place which is basically where the show has, for the majority of it, has been set in. And, of course, saying goodbye to the familiar cast of characters that some of us have grown to know and love. It was made to feel like we were saying goodbye to some friends. So, for instance, Vince definitely gets some character development. And I think his fight with Judd changes him a little bit to make him more thoughtful. And then when the boys all say goodbye, it's a nice little hint of brotherhood between the group because even Vince agrees to partake in the goodbye. And of course, throughout the series, we get departures from Blanche and Elizabeth. I do feel Blanche left too early because she was only in it for the latter half of the second season and the first quarter of this season. And, you know, we could have seen more from her, but, you know, I feel as though she could have been a very complex character indeed, and they could have expanded on her backstory a little bit more. And the entire break-in with Jess, it's because of Jess that the book thing started off anyway. Now, I have made a grave error in judgment regarding the character of Jess, because I thought she was Blanche's sister for some reason. You see, what I tend to do is I would tend to rush things because it's a bad habit of mine, and I've really got to slow down a little to get all the little major details. And then as for Elizabeth, I think we start to see a different side of her now. And that shows more in this series because we see a softer side to her, whereas when we first met her, she was a bit more of a sidekick for Sheila, whereas now she's grown into her own character. And she begins to resent Sheila a little bit after being asked to stay with her. It was a pretty emotional goodbye because, you know, these two were the only two of the original She Mob left. And they've been through ever such a lot together as friends. Um, and as for Vince, I think there are some nice moments between the characters as well. But in that episode, I think that Vince starts to change a bit. Matthias and Harriet's relationship continues to blossom, but he's left with the dilemma that should he join the army like he's supposed to, or be with the woman he loves, and he chooses Harriet over that. And it's nice that they get a happy ending. As for Judd, it's sad that he has to stay at the Foundling Hospital for yet another year. And it's nice that him and Vince get to say goodbye and have one final hug before he leaves. We get to see more of Detective Ned here. I love how he gets to solve the mystery of the poisonous flower and who exactly supplied it, and of course is backed up by Cranbourne. As for Walter, I love this bit of long-term storytelling where he gets to reunite with his father, and he indeed recalls his time in the army and getting injured, and Walter has finally found his father, the one person that he wanted to join the army in the first place for, to become the drummer boy in an episode of the first season. I really love that long-term storytelling. I was not expecting Mrs. Smith to turn out to be someone who basically planned something with Cook Jenkins to smuggle Ida in just to talk to Hetty for a few minutes. And then, of course, we get Cook Jenkins and the introduction up of Cook Jenkins segments in Kitchen. Oh, it's right, grand. And I shall miss Cook Jenkins as a character. I think she was the best character of this series, if I do say so myself. But it's sad that she left, though. But the Force Ghost of Obi-Wan Cook Jenkins 1 Kenobi lurks around the scullery of Calendar Hall, advising Sheila on what to do. Aye up, Sheila. The Force shall be with you, always. And for the start of the series, starting on Hetty running away for the second time, you'd have thought that she'd have learnt her lesson by now, but now she obviously escapes and finds out that London isn't as nice as it seems to be, because, you know, she's out on the streets and she eventually runs into a gang of street kids who later become relevant at the end of the series. And of course, we are introduced to Mr. Brunston, who I feel as though is much more of a puppet to Mr. Grace and a kind of like a bounty hunter than a villain. He basically just comes in the Foundling Hospital to report to Matron Bottomly what's going on. I like how Mrs. Smith served as a balance as well to oppose Matron, to look out for the welfare of the children. And in the scene where they all have the meeting about raising funds for the roof, Mrs. Smith, I think Matron knows what she's all about and knows that she's up to something. She sacrifices her job as one of the governors to make sure that Hetty is all right. And she knows she's not fooled very easily. She sees right through everybody. She can tell a lot about a person, and a good example of this is when she meets Hetty, and when Hetty continuously tells her that she's a writer. She knows what she's all about and brings her back to the Foundling Hospital. Throughout her time there, she is on Hetty's side all the way. The entire roof collapsing storyline. I love how everyone immediately goes into panic mode as this happens, and then eventually it all builds up to the farewell service when the roof eventually collapses. Everyone's evacuated and chaos endures, and this is Matron Bottomly's chance to finally leg it so that she can finally go to America. And I think that the another side plot of this entire series has been Matron going to America no matter what. And eventually, her ticket is given to Matthias, and Matthias, of course, reunites with Harriet. I also found Constable Clark and Nurse Winterson's whole love story irrelevant because the rules clearly state in those days, the rules, Cranbourne explained that the rules state that staff members may not marry. And I think Cranbourne was a bit irresponsible by changing these rules, and he was also a bit irresponsible by when he went up to the tower to find all the kids having their end of Foundling Hospital party, their little leaving party, and he just left them to it. Like, those kids could have been in any danger, and yet Cranbourne just let it pass him by. Now, this book had data about Matron Bottomly's various illegal trades, but yet they let Rosamund Calendar destroy it. What was the point in that? Like, this book could have turned the whole tide of the series had the police looked at it. But they decide to burn the book at the end of the series. And Rosamund does this out of shame. Well, what's the logic in this? I think Elizabeth I showed a more vulnerable side of herself, showed a more caring side of herself, and I think that has flourished mostly in series 3. And finally, we have Matron Bottomly. Yeah, this is where it all comes crashing down for her. I cannot praise Eva Pope's performance enough in the farewell service it- because Matron completely loses her sanity, like in that epic confrontation when her own staff turn against her. Matron completely loses it all, like, and she knows that this is the end. And even Colonel Brigwell, who entrusted her and had the utmost confidence in Matron, found out that, Matron is a lying, thieving, conniving Decepticon. She tried to bring Hetty down during her final days at the Foundling Hospital. She wanted to make it absolute hell, and you know she she did that by trapping her in the linen cupboard and making her watch her dear friend Harriet leave the Foundling Hospital um, with a tear in her eye and going into her carriage and leaving. Um, and I'm sure a lot of people were very satisfied to finally see Matron Bottomly get arrested by the series end. I do feel as though the clash at Calendar Hall was, I've said this earlier, that it was a bit rushed. Because, Hetty and Matron completely hate each other. And I think my favourite shot in this series is when Matron and Hetty are circling one another, staring at one another, as across the table. It really goes to show that how much this rivalry is gonna go and how far this feud will go. And how far they will both go to make each other's lives completely miserable. And she even lied to Mr. Bronston, and in the end, she lost it all. So yeah, it's nice to see that Matron finally gets her comeuppance. She's also a lot more snappy with Cranbourne in this series as well. That's because, she's determined to keep the Foundling Hospital as it is and not to move on. So yeah, that's me airing my grievances about Calendar Hall. So, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all later. So, arigato, sayonara, matane.